Welcome to today's webinar hosted by OraSure Technologies, Updating Your Drug Test Panel. Is it essential? I'm Jessica Polk of the Current Consulting Group, and I'll be conducting today's presentation. We'd like to thank OraSure for hosting today's webinar. OraSure Technologies is a global leader in oral fluid substance abuse testing products. Their unique assays provide accurate and easy to administer testing methods to help determine the presence or absence of drugs or alcohol in a person's system. The Intercept Oral Fluid Drug Test is an FDA-cleared laboratory-based oral fluid drug testing system that enables accurate testing for 9 drugs of abuse, including marijuana, cocaine, PCP, amphetamines, methamphetamines, barbiturates, benzodiazepine, methadone, and opiates. Intercept is fast and easy to administer and is ideal for workplace, criminal justice, drug treatment centers, clinical setting screening programs, and more. Today's presentation qualifies for continuing education credit from SHRM, HRCI, and from CCDAP. For those who attend today's presentation in its entirety, you will receive information following today's webinar on how to apply for those credits. We'd like to introduce our presenters today. Today we have with us Bill Current from the Current Consulting Group and Amy Weimer from OraSure Technologies. Bill is the author of Why Drug Testing, Updated and Expanded for 2020, as well as 9 other books on substance-related issues. He founded the Current Consulting Group in 1998, and it has become the #1 recognized brand name in compliance business development and operates consulting in the drug testing industry. Amy Weimer is an inside sales account manager at OraSure Technologies. For over 15 years, she has supported companies with drug and alcohol testing programs and with oral fluid technology. And I believe we'll begin today's presentation with Bill, so I'll go ahead and turn the virtual microphone over to you, Bill.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica, and welcome everyone to today's webinar presentation. I'm really excited to be presenting today with Amy. We've done some webinars in the past, and she really knows her stuff, so I think you're going to enjoy the back and forth that we have during today's presentation. This is the agenda for today's presentation. Amy's going to cover the first part on what is a typical drug test panel, and then we'll switch over to me, choosing the right testing method for your panel needs. And then it'll go back to Amy for the elephant in the room, marijuana and drug test panels. And then we'll switch back to me for a discussion on state laws and federal regulations as it pertains to drug test panels. And as we go from section to section, we're going to be conducting a poll for the section that just got completed. So at the end of section 1, there'll be a poll question. Jessica will ask you the question, you'll put in your answers, and then we'll discuss that, the results of the poll. So as we go through today's presentation, there'll be plenty of opportunities for you to actually participate through the polls, as well as submitting any questions that you have. So I know you've all come on to the webinar today to discuss drug test panels, but Amy and I are more than happy to entertain any questions that you have about drug testing, drug test panels, the marijuana situation, anything to do with drug testing, oral fluid testing, lab-based oral fluid testing. Feel free to submit your questions to us. And so with that, let me turn the microphone over to Amy to get us started with section 1.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the warm introduction, Jessica and Bill. I'm so thankful to be here today and to be able to share some information with you on drug testing panels. You might be thinking right now as you join this webinar that we haven't actually taken a look at our drug testing panel or our drug testing policy in years. You might have had some conversations about marijuana and all the new legislation that's around that, but you talked about it, you thought about it, but you just didn't quite know how to proceed. So you might be in that, if it's not broken, why change my panel? Why make any changes at this point in time? As you'll find out over the next hour, that now is really the time to weigh in on your panel and the pros and cons of adding and or potentially removing panels from your current drug testing panel. So over these next couple slides, I'm going to share some information with you and just explain some of the basic panels and where they are. You might think of your panel as a 5 or a 10 panel. It might even be referred to you from your drug testing provider as a NIDA 5. But what does that really mean? So the NIDA 5 was created by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and NIDA is actually the prime federal agency that supports the scientific studies and research on drug abuse and its consequences. So they developed this drug testing panel quite a few years ago, and it pertains to the 5 drugs of abuse specified to be tested in relationship to having a drug-free workplace. So the standard 5 panel is comprised of cannabinoids, which that's your marijuana, your THC, PCP, opiates, amphetamines, and cocaine. We'll get into the specifics of all of these drug classifications in much more detail over the next 15 or 20 minutes. You might also hear this 5 panel referred to as a SAMHSA 5 drug panel. So just know there's lots of different terminology out there. It all comes back to those same 5 drugs. But now what we're seeing is that we're testing for a broader range of drugs. So now you might hear people talking about an 8-panel drug test or a 10 or even a 12-panel drug test to cover more types of drugs that we're seeing used and abused in the workplace. And as we talk about adding and removing drug panels, you might even see as low as a 4-panel drug test or even a 7-panel. So numbers are just about anything. They can be any range right now, and they're just really specific to what you need in your company to maintain a safe and flowing workspace. Your panel type will also relate specific to the industry that you're in. So if you're in a safety sensitive workplace, you need to ensure that your drug testing panels cover all drugs. Those that are DOT and federally regulated also have specific guidelines for the drug classifications to be tested. So as you look at your policy and your workforce and what's important to you, you're going to want to also make sure that you're complying with any state or federal regulations, which Bill will get into here in section 3. So let's go back. What's a safety sensitive workplace? So we all have a general idea of what that is. It's a position that refers to a job where the employee is responsible for his or her own and other people's safety. So it also refers to jobs that would be particularly dangerous if performed under the influence of drugs or alcohol. So when I think of this, construction, that category always comes to mind first. And there's some really alarming statistical data around safety sensitive and construction. Construction positivity rates are much higher than the national standard, and they clock in at 11.6% of employees reporting illegal substance in the past month. And they're also the most likely of any industry to use cocaine and misuse prescription opioids, and second most likely to use marijuana. So as we're thinking about safety sensitive, let's keep in mind those different drug classifications that I just talked about specific to construction. And then another interesting data point that I found was that 7.4% of manufacturing workers ages 18 to 64 report using illicit drug use in the past month. And since we know that construction and manufacturing are very safety sensitive workplaces, we know that an accident that occurs there can be catastrophic, and there could be, worst case scenario, a loss of life. So we want to keep that in mind as we're thinking about drug testing panels, what your workplace looks like, and how to prevent any of these incidents from happening. And while I was looking for data, I found that these were also an interesting sidebar to what we are talking about. So these industries report heavy alcohol use in the past month. Mining, utility workers, and manufacturing were all over 10%. Mining was at 18%. So lots of things to think about here as we move into the next slide, which we're going to look at the standard 10-panel drug test. So actually, we can go back to that other slide that actually looks at the 10-panel drug test. And so this could be conducted with urine, hair, or oral fluid. Those are all types of drug testing modalities that are used within the workplace. And so we talked about the 5-panel, but then there's also other drugs that are included in many drug testing panels that are added on to that NIDA 5. And so when we add those on, we can also look for cocaine, marijuana, opioids, amphetamines, PCP, benzodiazepines, barbiturates, methadone, propoxyphene, and quaaludes. So it's possible to request an expanded drug panel test that could include a combination of 3 to 4 of these drugs, or to add them all on to equal that full 10 panel. So when we look at this 10 panel listing, kind of think about how this matches your current drug testing panel and your workplace needs and your workplace requirements. And how many boxes do you check off? And keep thinking about this, because we're going to get into this in a little bit more detail later. And I know as I work with many human resource and safety professionals on a daily basis, since I work at OraSure, and that's my primary customer base, I often get a lot of questions around what these drugs really are. I'm telling them, well, this panel includes this and this panel includes that, but it always comes down to what are the real world names of these drug classifications, and what do they mean if they enter my workplace? So now we can go on to the next slide, and we're going to actually get into what these drugs are and what they look like and what they can do within your workplace. So we all know marijuana is a very hot topic right now. It's in the news. Legislation's happening in just about every state to some degree as to where it is legalized, not legalized. And Bill, I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit more in section 3. So it has many, many different words. It can include hashish, which is the smoked psychoactive resins. And then the other hot topic right now are those CBD oils and those THC oils. So CBD has definitely been growing in popularity over the past few years. It's been used as a cure-all for everything from insomnia to cancer to even pet anxiety. And so this CBD is extracted from either the hemp plant or a mature marijuana plant, and is believed to be the active ingredient in the marijuana. So although CBD oil programs generally restrict the THC levels, a 2017 study found that nearly 7 in each of 10 CBD products did not contain the amount of THC advertised. So what that means is 43% of those products that were tested contained less CBD than what they had advertised, and 26% contained too much. And sometimes the CBD oils aren't regulated, and you might think that you're taking a tincture that does not have any THC in it, where it really could have THC in it and then could produce a positive on your drug test. So that's definitely a very hot topic right now as we talk about marijuana. So things to keep in mind as we continue digging into drug testing panels. Cocaine's always a standard on drug testing panels. It's a pretty straightforward category. You might hear it referred to as cocaine, crack, or freebase. And there's definitely reports coming out that there's been increased usage during the COVID-19 lockdowns of cocaine and entering into the workforce. Another hot topic that's been on the news and just very devastating is opioid testing. And there are many different classifications that fall into this category. You could have heroin, which heroin's an opioid drug made from morphine. It's a natural substance taken from opium poppy plants. And it's been around for a very long time and very prominent, unfortunately, in our society. Then you have like your morphine, codeine, oxycodone, oxymorphone, hydrocodone, hydromorphone. Most of these are at very high risk for addiction and dependence. They're typically used to help with moderate to severe pain. And as many of these can have a prescription for them, many of them are abused and are sold as street drugs. And then you also have opium in this category, and that's the dried latex that's obtained from seed capsules of the opium poppy. So that's definitely on the illegal drug trade side of things. And we can move on to the next round of drugs on our next slide. So then we have benzodiazepines. You might know these from their professional names as Valium, Xanax, or Ativan drugs. These are more of your tranquilizers and or antidepressants. Amphetamines, they're also, these are your methamphetamines, these are your uppers, so your meth, your speed, can also fall into the category of ADHD prescription medications. Those would be your Ritalin, your Adderall, and also this MDMA falls into this category, which ecstasy and Molly, and MDA, which is yet another drug typically referred to on the street as SAS or Sally. And then yet another panel to consider for your drug testing panel would be barbiturates. And these are all of your barbitals. So there are many of them out there. They have lots of letters before them, but they're all your barbitals. And they're typically used to treat and prevent seizures, sedation, also help with insomnia. So they more or less slow the activity of your brain and your nervous system. So as with most of these prescription drugs listed above, they produce some level of sedation and can cause a potential substance that you do not want in your workplace due to the effects that they give. And then we're going to move on to the next slide, because yet there are more drugs out there that you can add to your drug testing panel. You can always add PCP. That was actually developed in the 1950s as an intravenous anesthetic, but the human use was discontinued almost immediately after use, but it is still being abused today. Not as widely as abused, although some uptick around some metropolitan areas have happened as of recently. And then you have methadone, and that's typically is used as part of a treatment plan for opioid addiction. However, sometimes it is also abused as a street drug. And what it does is it blocks the high from drugs like codeine, heroin, morphine, and oxycodone. So it can also be used as pain treatment, but as I said earlier, it can also be abused and also leads to addiction and abuse. And then you have Quaaludes, and they're no longer legitimately manufactured, but there are still some instances of finding them on the street or illegally manufactured. And then we also have Propoxyphene, which is, you might hear as Darvon, and that's another pain reliever. So I'm sure after all of that information, your head might be spinning as to which drug testing panel, what you need to have on your drug testing panel. So we're going to let Jessica ask a question, and I want you to think about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. The question is, what category of drugs most concern you in the workplace? I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll. And so we're looking at marijuana, cocaine, prescription opioids, or everything. So if you want to go ahead and just give us a quick vote to, after all of that information from Amy, where your concerns lie. I'll just give you another second. We are looking at the category of drugs most concern to those of you on the call in the workplace, and we had 22% marked marijuana, 2% marked cocaine, 16% said prescriptions, opioids, and 60% of you said everything. So I will go ahead and hide these results, and we should be back to you, Bill.
Okay, perfect. Well, I probably agree with the people who said everything. An interesting thing has occurred since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw a significant surge in substance abuse. online sales of alcoholic beverages, of medical marijuana, other sales of marijuana through legal means, through various dispensaries, et cetera, all shot up significantly in 2020. And so coming out of 2020, we know that substance abuse was on the rise, a lot more alcohol use, a lot more marijuana, but something very interesting occurred as well. So going into 2019, so in 2018, we saw a drop in opioid usage. And so we thought that was a good thing. We're going in the right direction. Opioid overdoses and fatalities were down, but in 2019, they started going up again. Not at a significant pace, but they were definitely on the rise. In 2020, opioid use went up significantly, as well as overdoses and opioid-related fatalities. So we know that drug abuse is up, marijuana use is up, and opioid use is up as well. One major drug testing company shared their 2020 positivity rates with us. So this is a company that represents lots of different drug testing, or lots of different employers, tens of thousands of employers. And they found that marijuana positives for random drug testing, which I think is a real good indicator of where we're at with things when you look at the random testing rate. For random testing, marijuana positives were up about 20%. Significant, right? 20%. Cocaine was down slightly, but the two categories that were up the most were opioids, over 230% increase from 2019 to 2020, and amphetamines, which were up just over 20%, or just over 200% in 2020. So amphetamines and opioids were up significantly. I mean, really, really up in 2020. What's interesting from the results from this one company is that amphetamine positives were higher than marijuana positives. And they said that was the first time that had ever happened. Marijuana always is the #1 drug when it comes to positivities. But in 2020, for random testing, a company that represents a lot of employers with safety sensitive workers, amphetamines were #1, and then marijuana, and then opioids. So when people ask me, which drug should we test for? I say test for the drugs that people are using. They're using marijuana, they're using opioids, they're using amphetamines, and they're still using cocaine. Even though that one went down, they're still using cocaine, and of course alcohol at an even higher rate than both marijuana and amphetamines. But those are the drugs that people are using, and if you marked everything, you probably were thinking beyond the list of marijuana, cocaine, and opioids. So let's talk about testing methods for different types of panels, right? So the testing method is, as Amy was talking about, lab-based versus point of collection, as well as urine testing, oral fluid testing, which both of those methods are available as a lab-based test and as a point of collection test. And then of course, hair testing, which is always a lab-based test. So panels, as Amy was talking about, can be customized, okay? A lot of flexibility, especially with lab-based testing. So like if you were to approach Amy and say, I want to test for these 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 or 12 or 15 drugs, she'd be able to do that for you, but it would be easier to some degree when it comes to lab-based testing. Instant testing devices are a little bit less flexible, and I'll talk about that in a second, okay? But when it comes to lab-based urine and lab-based oral fluid testing, there's a lot of flexibility there. Rapid testing, rapid result testing, instant result testing, point of collection, point of care, POCT, all kinds of different names. Back in the early days, it was called on-site testing because the test typically took place in the workplace. But by whatever name you're used to using, a rapid result is a single-use device that yields a positive or negative result within 15 to 20 minutes after you do the test with this rapid result. Okay. Typically with these rapid result devices, you have predetermined panels, okay? Whether it's an oral fluid rapid test or a urine rapid test, you're buying sort of a preset panel with the cup. There's a variety, of course. We're not talking to just about 5 or 7. You can find instant testing result devices out there with a variety of panels, okay, depending on what your needs are. But typically, you're going to choose from some predetermined panels, okay? 5 and 7 panels are very common, but even more than that. Now, Under the DOT regulations, it's always lab-based, and it's always lab-based urine at this point. We know that DOT was in the process of developing regulations for lab-based oral fluid testing when the pandemic kind of threw everybody into a state of chaos in the federal government. So we know DOT regulations for lab-based oral fluid are coming. We don't know when exactly at this point. Everything was sort of, the timetables were derailed by COVID, but we know it's coming. Right now, though, a DOT test is a lab-based urine test. And sometimes you hear different panels mentioned for a DOT test, but it's always the same drugs. Some people refer to it as the NIDA-5, the SAMHSA-5, the DOT-5, or they might add on some of these subcategories of drugs. So on the left, the left side of the screen, my left side of the screen, I think it's yours as well, you see the typical ones: marijuana, cocaine, the amphetamine category, like Amy talked about, and then on the right side, you see the opioid family of drugs and all the different drugs that fall into that category, and then phencyclidine or PCP. So of these 5 different drug categories, let's call it the NIDA-5 or the SAMHSA-5, you've got marijuana, which is going to produce the most positives. You've got cocaine, which is up there as well, but you also have the family of opioids, synthetic opioids like hydrocodone, hydromorphone, oxycodone, oxymorphone, etc. And you're going to see more positives in those with those drugs than maybe 2 years ago. But the NIDA or SAMHSA-5 is going to be this panel. That you can't go to your provider and say, for my DOT testing, I want to add, barbiturates and benzodiazepines, etc., because they're not part of this required, approved, limited panel. This is a very popular panel. So in a little bit later in today's presentation, I'm going to talk about state laws and how they affect panels. But if a state law says, or sort of punts on the issue of the panel and basically refers to the SAMHSA drugs or the DOT drug panel, then this is what it's talking about. And there are some states that do that just allow testing for the DOT panel. And if it says that, or it says SAMHSA, or if it says NIDA, some of them have sort of older language and refers to NIDA. This is the panel. What you're seeing on the screen basically is the panel now. So these are common panels that you'll see referred to. A 4 panel is becoming more common because those are companies that have decided to take marijuana out of their panel. Now, at the Current Consulting Group, we did a survey earlier this year, co-sponsored by OraSure, where we asked employers, how many of you have removed marijuana from your drug test panel? And it wasn't a large percentage, actually. It was, a disturbing percentage nonetheless, but it was around 5%. So there's a percentage of employers out there that are asking their provider to remove marijuana from their drug test panel, and that sort of becomes a 4-panel test. Not very common, but sometimes you'll hear somebody refer to a 4-panel test, and it usually means the SAMHSA-5 minus marijuana. A 5-panel would be that typical DOT type of test where it includes marijuana, cocaine, amphetamines, opioids or opiates, and phencyclidine or PCP. And then 7-panel or 10-panel or 12-panel, it just depends. Like Amy was talking about, if you're an employer in a safety-sensitive workplace, or you're a provider that works with a lot of safety-sensitive employers with a lot of safety-sensitive employees, people who are operating forklifts or driving delivery trucks or things of that nature, then you're probably going to go with a bigger panel. Not for DOT testing, of course, but for your own non-mandated testing where your state laws permit it, you're probably going to go with a higher panel, like a 10-panel as it says here, because it's going to cover some more of those drugs that are being commonly abused right now throughout the country, right? Coming out of the pandemic, and I realize we're still in the pandemic in many ways, but we're opening up, a lot more people are back to work, the unemployment rate has come down significantly, but at the same time, substance abuse is at record levels. If you look at the report that comes out every year from SAMHSA, SAMHSA's been doing this report on substance abuse in America for more than 30 years now, probably 40 years, going back to the 70s. You'll see that between 2019, or I should say between 2018 and 2019, so in 2020, the results of the 2019 survey came out, So that's the latest data that we have. So between 2018 and 2019, the rate of substance abuse went up significantly, and it shows the levels of substance abuse by drugs. So find that survey if you want to look at it that way, or find other information that's out there that shows the level of substance abuse by drug. When we talk about drug test methods, though, it's important to note that an oral fluid test is going to have a shorter window of detection, but it gives you the unique ability to detect drugs almost immediately after somebody's used the drugs. Because scientifically, oral fluid mimics blood, and blood by scientific standards is sort of the gold standard of testing, not practical, not even allowed for workplace testing in many states. But scientifically, it's the gold standard. Well, oral fluid mimics blood from a scientific standpoint because it's testing for the parent drug. You're actually testing for the drug and not a metabolite of the drug. Marijuana, you're gonna have a metabolite of the drug available in somebody's system in several hours. But if you want to know if somebody was smoking pot during their lunch break because they smell of marijuana and you have reasonable suspicion to test them, then the oral fluid test is probably going to show a positive if they were smoking pot in the parking lot, if it's above the standard cutoff level. Whereas with urine testing, the metabolite's not going to be detectable 30 minutes after the person used the drug. So for recent use detection and in marijuana friendly states, when we're talking about different panels and when we're talking about different testing methods, you're probably going to want oral fluid testing, either lab-based or instant or rapid result oral fluid testing. If you're not concerned about recent use detection, then you can look at urine testing, which has a window of detection about 3 or 4 days, but you have that lag time of say 7-8 hours before the metabolite of the drug becomes detectable. And those two methods, urine and oral fluid, are both available as either a rapid result test, a single use disposable testing device, or as a lab-based test. I like both urine and oral fluid. I like point of collection and lab-based. I think there are needs for both of those, and there are circumstances where, depending on your situation, you'll prefer one over the other. But it's important to know that both lab-based oral fluid testing and lab-based urine testing have been endorsed by SAMHSA. They're federally government-approved endorsed testing methods. You have to follow those very strict guidelines for how to do the test. But when you do, if you follow those mandatory guidelines for either urine or oral fluid, you have that increased level of legal defensibility, and you can test for a lot of different drugs outside of the DOT regulations. For hair testing, you've got that long 90-day window of detection, but drugs don't become detectable in a hair sample for say 7 to 10 days. So perfect for a testing situation where you're looking for lifestyle indicators of drug use, but not great for recent use. For recent use, oral fluid's the only recent use detection method endorsed by the federal government. So a lot of flexibility with lab-based testing and panels, and the ability to test for recent use with oral fluid, which is ideal in marijuana-friendly states where some states have placed restrictions or conditions on employers testing for marijuana and also having to show at the same time as a positive result some connection to or some evidence or proof of impairment. So as we sort of transition to the next phase, let's do another survey. I'm going to turn the microphone back over to Jessica, and then Amy will bring us out of.
Okay, we're going on to our next panel question, and that question asks, what panel do you think is ideal for a workplace? The 4-panel test, no marijuana included, the 5-panel test, DOT standards, the 7-panel test, which is including prescription drugs, or the 10-panel test with the more the better. I'll give you just a few seconds to go ahead and participate on which of these 4 options is most ideal for your workplace.
Thank you so much. What these results are telling me are very similar to what I'm hearing right now with my current client base and with those people calling about questions at OraSure with their drug testing program. What you have to remember is that there's no one panel or one drug testing methodology, one type of collection, whether that's oral fluid, whether that's urine testing, whether that's hair, all of those different things that Bill discussed in his last section, that it's not a one size fits all, but these results pretty much are in line with the conversations I have daily, and most of my clients also have a 10 panel, and the more drugs they can test for, the better. I will say I do have some that have moved to a 4 panel, and I have some that stick with their standard 5 panel, and I also have some with 7, 8, 9, and 12 panels. So we have all those different options for you. So I appreciate your feedback in the poll, and your answers are very close to those things that I see and hear every day. So now we're going to move in to the next section. We can bring on the slide that goes with, and our topic now is the elephant in the room, so to speak, and that would be marijuana in your drug testing panel. But as we saw from your last vote on our poll question, that it was not a very high response to have a 4-panel drug test, and that 4-panel drug test is typically that standard 9 to 5, that DOT drug test that drops marijuana off of it. So as you're thinking about this elephant in the room and you're thinking about marijuana and your drug testing panel, I want you to list out your specific pros and cons of removing marijuana from your panel. Is there anything that would help you within your workforce if you removed it? Is there anything that it would be a disadvantage to you? And I really do encourage you to write them down and share that with your coworkers before you make any changes to your drug testing program. So let's talk about what happens when you choose to remove it. By removing marijuana, you could be missing out, of course, on potential drug users and those drug users entering your workforce. You could be known as an employer that does not test for marijuana. Therefore, you're finding more of those marijuana using job applicants coming to your facility. And then you have to think about, too, how do your current employees feel about these potential drug users being hired within your company, and how that affects the safety of your workforce? How does that affect your morale? How does that affect just so many different levels within your company? And last but not least, what is the cost of an accident to your company? There's so many factors here, but we just don't want to forget about there's also the potential loss of life when you have an accident, especially in a safety-sensitive type of workforce. So should you remove marijuana from your drug testing panel? You need to be aware and up to date on that changing landscape of state laws regarding marijuana testing, and Bill's going to go into that in depth in his next section. That is definitely his wheelhouse, so we will let him carry that one. I want to let you know that our link to our state-by-state guide will be put up in the chat, so please be sure to copy and paste and save that for reference. And if you ever need it, that can also be accessed either at Current Consulting Group or at OraSure Technologies. And please know that your feelings are absolutely correct. There is no risk-free decision. The need for workforce and the workforce right now and hiring, it's extremely high right now in the United States, as Bill was alluding to, with things opening back up, and production and the job force is back. And all those people need to return to work, and they need to have a pre-employment drug screen. And so we know that there are lots of decisions being made, but there are no risk-free decisions that go along with updating your drug testing policy. So removing marijuana from your panel just introduces that risk of employees under the influence of marijuana while working. I know I've noted a shift in our return to work and onboarding of new hires with drug testing programs and some changes to my current customers' drug testing panels, that they have decided to maintain marijuana testing on their post-accident, but remove it from their pre-employment. So know that is an option. It is out there. Again, you have to weigh those pros and cons for you and your specific needs within within your company. You still leave that window open to hire without having marijuana on your panel. And now that you're thinking about these effects of keeping or removing marijuana from your panel, let's take a deeper dive into what these potential costs of removing panel from your what removing marijuana from your panel looks like. That could be a workplace accident. I don't think I really need to go any further on this one. While it could be very small, it could also be catastrophic with injury or loss of life. In the non-safety sensitive workplace, it could look like a data breach caused by employee negligence or work ethic, behavior, or the morale of others within your organization. And then there's also the legal liability from dangerous employees under the influence of drugs at your workplace. And I found some very interesting data points as we chat about adding opioids to your panel. So we talked about removing marijuana or keeping marijuana on your drug testing panel, but there's also some interesting data points as we think about then adding those opioids onto your panel. An estimated 1.7 million US residents suffer from substance abuse disorders related to prescription opioids. That's 11.4 million Americans misusing prescription opioids. So we only know that with that amount of US residents using opioids and misusing them, that it has to spill into the workforce. So this can cause to miss work. One study I read stated that an average of 29 days per year were the amount of missed days caused by opioid use. Of course, that also enters into positive drug test results, impaired or decreased job performance. And that list just really goes on, and it's really dependent to the nature of you and your workforce. On the flip side, many are asking, should they add opioids to their drug testing panel? And again, let's go back, list your pros and cons, and weigh in on what that means for you and what that means for your organization. Many are prescription drugs, and we know that prescription drug abuse is rampant. And one might ask, what if my employee has a valid prescription for these? And I want you to know that that is the purpose of your medical review officer. And they will make that determination for you without your needing to know any more information from your candidate or employee. So know that in a full-fledged drug testing program where you have a medical review officer, they're going to take care of that part for you and gather any of that information and make that determination on a positive or a negative drug test result for you. So many feel that post-accident suspicion or for-cause testing should have a full 10-panel drug test, and that would be to include those opioids. And now that we have thought about all these different scenarios, thoughts, and I'm sure you have all these questions going through your head once again, Jessica is going to lead us into another poll question.
Thank you, Amy. Yes, our next poll question is, do you think removing marijuana from a workplace drug testing program is a good idea? Yes, no, I'm not sure. And I'm going to share the results again. Removing marijuana from a workplace drug testing program, is it a good idea? And from our audience, we're seeing 9% said yes, 73% are saying no, and 18% are still unsure. So I'll go ahead and hide away these results, take us back into our presentation, and turn it back over to you, Bill, to move forward.
Okay. Excellent information. Thank you, audience, for participating in the survey or in the polls that we do at the end of each section. So let me go back to something I was referring to earlier. So in our current consulting group survey, which was co-sponsored by OraSure, 5% of employers said that they had either removed marijuana from their drug testing panel or they were considering it. When we asked that group of people why they would remove marijuana from their drug test panel, 33% said it was because it wasn't legal to test for marijuana in their state. So that's a perfect indication of the misinformation that is going around about legal marijuana and drug testing and what you can and cannot do as an employer, because testing for marijuana is legal in all 50 states. There are states that have placed conditions on what employers can do with a positive marijuana result. And 2 municipalities, New York and Philadelphia, have passed city ordinances banning pre-employment testing for marijuana. But every state allows testing for marijuana. There is no state that has outlawed testing for marijuana for pre-employment or for existing employees. And even in New York and Philadelphia, where they've passed city ordinances banning pre-employment testing for marijuana, those lawmakers have actually included a long, and in New York's case, a growing list of safety-sensitive occupations that are exempt from the ban. So in other words, even the lawmakers who are passing laws that ban testing for marijuana on a pre-employment test in New York and Philadelphia, they recognize that you don't want somebody operating a forklift or driving a delivery truck or a police officer or a fireman at work performing their safety-sensitive duties under the influence of marijuana. So a little bit hypocritical maybe, but nonetheless, we're seeing some of these laws passed that are placing conditions on employers and what they can do with a positive result. But no state has actually outlawed testing for marijuana. It is legal to test for marijuana in all 50 states. And as one of our audience participants submitted the question, you don't have the option to remove marijuana from a DOT panel. And DOT testing preempts, the federal law preempts the state law. So even in a state that's legalized marijuana and has placed some conditions on testing for marijuana, or more appropriately said, what you can do with the result of a positive test for marijuana, it doesn't affect the DOT regulations. If you fall under the DOT regulations, you must pre-employment and post-employment test for marijuana. It's just part of the federal law. It's the regulation. But it is important to know that some states in their drug testing law include references to a drug test panel. Now, there are different types of drug testing laws, right? There's mandatory laws that apply to any employer in the state that wants to do drug testing. There's voluntary laws, like here in Florida, where the law only applies to employers that participate in some state-sponsored program. Here in Florida, for example, if you qualify, you can participate in a program that gives you a 5% discount on your workers' comp premiums. And if you're in that program, then you have to test according to the guidelines provided by the state. And it will dictate things like lab-based versus point of collection, which drugs to test for, et cetera, et cetera. So in those kinds of situations, you have to follow the guidance in the voluntary law if you're in that state, or if you're in that program. There are other states, though, that have industry-specific laws. Like in Illinois, for example, they have a law that applies to public works contractors. And those employers must test for marijuana because the public works contractor law in Illinois defers to the SAMHSA guidelines for when to test, how to test, who to test, et cetera. There are other states that have laws or regulations, language built into their workers' comp and unemployment comp regulations that make it possible under certain circumstances for an employer to move to deny workers' comp benefits or unemployment comp benefits. And some of those laws dictate what a drug panel should be. In most cases, they're simply punting on the issue and deferring to the federal guidelines, the SAMHSA, NIDA, DOT guidelines, whatever name you want to use. But there are states that are very specific about which drugs you can test for. In many cases, in the mandated states, the states that have mandated drug testing laws, they'll refer to maybe the Controlled Substances Act, or they may have a list in their own state of controlled substances, and it'll refer to specific sections of their own state list of controlled substances and say whether or not you can test for those drugs. They may not list them all, but they'll say you can test for any drugs that are in Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 or Schedule 3, et cetera, in the Controlled Substances Act, okay? But you have to know what those state laws are. That's why you can't really have a one-size-fits-all drug testing policy, because different states have different requirements for lots of different things, including your drug panel. Mississippi is a good example. Let me read the screen to you. An employer may include in its drug and alcohol testing protocols marijuana, cocaine, opiates, amphetamines, phencyclidine, alcohol, and other controlled substances. However, if testing for controlled substances other than those specifically named above is conducted, testing for such substances can be done only if an appropriate federal agency has established an approved protocol and positive threshold for each substance. And that's not always the case. There may be a lot of drugs listed in the Controlled Substances Act and the various schedules, but that doesn't mean the federal government has protocols in place for testing for those drugs. And so you need to know what the state law language says. Which state law applies to if you're in multiple states? All of them. So you're headquartered in Georgia, but you're in 35 states. You need to know the laws of each of those states so that in those states, you're in compliance with the laws. Now, there are a lot of new laws coming into place. We're updating our database all the time when it comes to marijuana. Two prominent examples are Philadelphia and New York City, as I mentioned before. It's important to know the New York City law is already in place, and they've already updated and expanded the list of safety sensitive functions that are exempt from the ban on marijuana testing for pre-employment in the city. So it's sort of evolving still. The Philadelphia law, as you see there, goes into effect in 2022. But it's important to know that even in those laws, now in Philadelphia, it only applies to Philadelphia. It doesn't apply to the rest of Pennsylvania. But in Philadelphia, it's important to know what the ban includes and what it doesn't include, which safety sensitive occupations are excluded from the ban and which ones include the ban. So you need to know which jobs or which occupations are covered or not covered, so that in the city of Philadelphia, you're in compliance. In the city of New York, you're in compliance. Nevada is an interesting situation, and of all the states that have legalized marijuana, either for medicinal use or for recreational use, Nevada is an interesting one, very unique. They're all different. There's no one size fits all legislation that's being used throughout the country. Every state that's legalized marijuana has its own set of requirements. In fact, some of you may know that New Jersey voters voted to legalize recreational marijuana back in November during the general election, but there were no conditions for workplace that were included in public question number 1. So since the first of the year, the state legislature has passed amendments to the law that apply to the workplace. Nevada is an example of a law that was passed that had conditions applicable to the workplace built into it. And if you look at the second bullet, or the third bullet, it says Nevada does prohibit refusal to hire a prospective employee based on a positive pre-employment marijuana test. So in other words, in Nevada, somebody can come to a job interview high on marijuana, test positive, and you can't deny them the job just based on that. However, there may be other circumstances that you as an employer would use to justify not hiring somebody, and it may not have anything to do with the positive marijuana test. Same in a employee testing situation, post-accident or reasonable suspicion. There may be some conditions in a state like Nevada or Illinois, for example, just to use two examples there, where there may be limitations on what an employer can do in terms of adverse employment action based on a marijuana positive. Doesn't mean you have to remove marijuana from your drug test panel, and I would advise you not to, but be prepared to comply with the conditions that are in those laws. Most often what you see is a law that says you cannot discriminate against a registered medical marijuana user, or you cannot take adverse employment action against somebody, an employee, who tests positive for marijuana, unless you can also create a connection or provide proof that the individual was impaired at the time of the drug test. So those are all things that come into play when you're looking at state laws and drug test panels. There is no state that has outlawed testing for marijuana. So you can test for marijuana in all states right now at this time, but you need to know if there are conditions that apply, like in Illinois, like in Nevada, like in other states. You need to know the laws. So let's go to our last poll question. Let me turn the microphone over to Jessica.
Thank you, Bill. All right, let's go ahead and launch this last poll. Do you think more jurisdiction will restrict workplace marijuana testing in the future? Yes, more jurisdictions will restrict marijuana testing. No, this is not a trend that we will see going forward, or I'm not sure. So it looks like the majority of our attendees today do see that more jurisdiction will restrict marijuana testing in the future at 83%. 6% said no, and 11% said I'm not sure. And so we'll go ahead and hide this result. And with the time that we have remaining, we're right here at the top of the hour. We have had some questions submitted, and our presenters did a great job actually of answering those questions, many of those questions while presenting. Thank you for that information, of course. We'd like to go ahead and wrap today's presentation up, thanking Bill and Amy for their expertise and for all the information that was shared today. We, of course, want to thank OraSure Technologies, and we'll go to our variation for OraSure Technologies. If you have any questions or if you'd like to get in touch with a representative over at OraSure, here's their contact information. We hope that you found today's presentation informative and helpful. This presentation was recorded, and you will receive instructions informing you how to access the recording via email, as well as information about the continuing education credits that were pre-approved for today's presentation from SURE, HRCI, and from CCDAP. For those who attended today's presentation in its entirety, we will send you the information for these credits. You don't even need to request them. We'll go ahead and verify your attendance and send that information on to you. So with that, we'd like to thank you again for your attendance today, and this concludes today's webinar. Have a nice day.